Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wisdom Seeker Live podcast. Hope that you'll be able to join and share your thoughts and ideas with us today, and look forward to hearing from you. As always, we like to start off the show podcast by talking about what wisdom is, at least from our vantage point, and so want to cover that real quickly. And wisdom is a process or a journey for us, and that journey is a three-step process or journey, if you will. And it starts with gaining knowledge, and that is just information, facts, figures, whatever that is out there. And we collect that formally, informally. Hopefully, we are choosing to learn something, learn new knowledge on a regular basis, because it's a starting point for us to gain wisdom. But the second step in this process, excuse me, got a little bit of a frog this morning. Second step in that process is that we begin to gain understanding. And understanding is where we take knowledge that we have gained and we begin to apply it. We use it in our everyday life. We begin to see how to answer questions, solve problems through the knowledge that we picked up. And also, as part of that, we're gaining experience, and that includes internalizing the knowledge that we have so that it's more than just data, facts and figures, and so on. So we go from knowledge to understanding, and unfortunately, many stop with that step and miss the biggest step that we need, and that is to step into wisdom. And wisdom is about our perspective and seeing things, including our knowledge and understanding, through a different lens, a bigger perspective, if you will, much bigger. Not only do we need to see ourselves and how our decisions affect us, but seeing the bigger picture, seeing a larger perspective, and realizing that our choices not only affect us, but affect others, and begin to understand the outcomes or consequences of our choices. And the way I like to sum it up in another way is, for those of us that are of a spiritual bent, that that step and that perception and perspective are seeing things through God's eyes. And that is where we begin to have wisdom, how we begin to look beyond just the moment, or even look beyond the past. So that's that journey that we want everyone to get on, is to join in seeking wisdom out, moving beyond just knowledge or even experience, but moving into the realm of wisdom. So welcome, Varshith and Tushar and Rick and Eunice. Glad to have all of you with us today. And the topic that we're going to be addressing and seeking wisdom in is about wisdom in relationships. And quite often we approach relationships without wisdom. We approach it with facts, figures, even experiences, but we forget to apply wisdom in relationships. So we'll talk some more about that. Eunice shares a thought, says, which is greater, wisdom or love? Relationship is like two wheels moving together. It needs attention and effort. We should not allow our love to grow old. Well, let's see, Eunice. The Bible says that the greatest commandment that we have is love, to love God, love each other as we love ourselves. And so love is a characteristic, and it's a choice that we make wisdom, though, is also a choice, and the Bible tells us that we should seek wisdom out more than we should seek gold and money and wealth and things like that. So, which is greater? I don't know. I think that the key there is it's not either or, but both. That if we're going to live well, that we need both. And indeed, your comment is that we have to maintain our love, no doubt, because that is our motivation for all we should do is that of love. And maybe we should even do a podcast on the topic of love, because I think it's greatly misunderstood. And so, good question, though. I don't, like I said, I'm not sure that it's one is greater than the other. I think they're both equally valuable and important. And Varshas makes a comment that love and goes on hand in hand. Love, and I think you're probably saying love and wisdom. And yes, they indeed go hand in hand. They are two parts of the same. So, how do we find wisdom in relationships? One of the things that I think that we need to apply the principles of wisdom in relationships is looking beyond the moment of a relationship. Now, bear in mind, when I talk about relationships, these are relationships of quite a variety. It's not one type or another. They each have their own unique nuances, but it could be a collegial relationship at work. It could be a neighborly relationship at home. It could be relationships with family. It could be romantic relationships with a significant other. There are a lot of different relationships, but I think the principle of wisdom, it becomes a value in those relationships. Welcome, Lydia. Glad to have you with us. So, wisdom being the greater perspective and context, and if we apply it in our relationships, it helps us to work through the struggles in our relationships. One of the problems that we have in relationships is when we have disagreement or conflict, it's real easy to get caught up in just the moment and only see or feel the what's going on at that time. Whereas if we make it a point to apply wisdom in those relationships, it helps us to step back. It helps us to remember, for example, if you're having conflict with a person of a significant relationship, and maybe of a romantic sort, or with a spouse, and that you got that conflict, it's real easy to lose sight of what brought you to that relationship in the beginning. And quite often in the moment, we forget that. We lose that context. But if we begin to apply the principles of wisdom, that's part of the perspective we're going to have before we say and do things that we shouldn't say, that could potentially damage a relationship. And the same principle applies in relationships in any setting. When we get in those moments in those relationships where things are a challenge and we lose sight of the perspective that wisdom brings, we quite often say that we say things that we regret, or even things that cause harm to the relationship to a point that it's very hard to overcome them. So the wisdom and the value of the wisdom in a relationship is that big perspective, that big picture, and seeing beyond just our own self and our own personal needs and wants. So that's one way that the principle of wisdom becomes valuable in relationships. Welcome, Lee. Glad to have you, um, and appreciate it. And see what Lee's comment is. Says maybe even both, a romantic relationship with your spouse. It does happen. Let's hope so. And that is certainly a goal, is to have a, uh, a deep relationship that includes romance with our spouses. And so, yes, I agree that hopefully they aren't two separate things. But in terms of relationship and wisdom in relationship, part of what we need to do, especially as we're going into relationships that may be long term, is again, get that wise perspective, that bigger picture. And what are the implications of that relationship potentially in our life? How are we going to work with these people that we're relating to? By the way, it occurred to me as I was thinking about this topic that, relationship, the root word of that is to relate. And so part of what we need to consider as being wise in our perspectives is to look at how do we relate, on what levels and in what ways, and use wisdom to find ways to relate, especially when we're dealing with conflict in a relationship. Again, the value of wisdom is that it helps us to look at that bigger picture in those situations that easily pull us into just that moment and gets us in trouble. And so one of the examples of a wise approach is when we are in the process of selecting a potential mate or spouse, or whatever term you like to use, is that it is wise to ask some bigger picture questions about that relationship and find answers to those questions through wise observation and seeking out wisdom in regards to it, because that will help us to avoid situations where we are getting in relationships that aren't going to endure well, or that are going to be a very challenging relationship. And it doesn't mean that just because a relationship's challenging that we don't get involved, but at the same time, better that we have the perspective going in, knowing as much as possible what we're getting into. And I know in relationships, there's no guarantees, because circumstances change and even people change at times. But getting that bigger picture look in relationships help us to avoid relationships that could cause us trouble. And but at the same time, it can also help us to avoid conflict in those relationships that we need to have. And it also, as we are approaching relationships with wisdom, it helps us to prioritize those relationships, because part of the problem is that we don't always have those relationships in the correct priority. For example, when we move into a marriage relationships, one of the things that our priority has to shift from our relationship to our parents versus our spouse. And so really approaching that and considering a lot of wisdom in regards to it helps you to reset that priority. And it's a challenge, and a lot of couples never quite get through that part of the adjustment and reset of priorities, and it causes a lot of trouble in those relationships. So just again, if we approach these relationships with wisdom, hopefully we have healthier relationships, or avoid relationships we shouldn't be in to start with. Let's see. Lee has a comment. He says, women marry men hoping they will change, but they don't. Men marry women hoping they will not change, but they do. It's an interesting dilemma, and I think that's a bit of wisdom to consider, is that going into relationships, how men and women approach those, and that they're different. It doesn't mean that one's better than the other, more right than the other. It just means they're different. And the wise person goes in understanding that from the beginning. And yes, there is a tendency for ladies to want to change the men that they are engaged with or involved with, hoping to get them more suitable for their need or desire. And as Lee mentions, it doesn't happen, generally speaking. Doesn't mean that there aren't miracles out there, and because there are, but most of the time that's a bad approach. And in the same way, we need to be wise to understand that, and I'm not sure I completely agree that women change. I think it's just that going in, quite often we don't have wise approach to it, and we don't realize what that relationship is really about. And that gets into a difference between men and women and communication with each other and with others. So again, wisdom in looking at that going in becomes really important. One of the questions that I've always suggested to anyone considering getting married, and we could talk on this topic for a long time, but for today, I'm going to keep it brief. But one question I think that helps bring some context and wisdom to that relationship, if you're considering marriage or long-term relationship, and that is, if you're a man looking at a potential wife, that you look at that wife or that person, and then you look at their family, and in particular, you look at their mother, and you ask the question, are you willing, are you committed to be able to live and have a good life with that person, that woman, if she becomes like her mother? And I say that and suggest that because it is very common that a woman will become, in not every way, but in a number of ways, like their mother, especially those that have looked at their mother and said, I'll never be like that. That usually almost guarantees it. And then from a man's point of view, from a woman's point of view, as she looks at the potential mate in a man, strongly encourage them to ask the question, could I live with this person's father? Is that something I could put up with, or make a good life with? Because again, same issue that men going to tend to be in a number of ways like their father. So just really ask those bigger picture questions, the down the road questions, if you will, and that will make a big difference. Some other wise questions to ask if getting into those relationships is to discuss children and how they are raised, how they're brought up, because the challenge is that when we are as a couple going through things, we will manage it one way. But when children come into the mix, our priorities shift and change. In fact, it is not uncommon that when children come along, that even people that are not typically practicing any religion or the like will, as children come along, consider that possibility, that question. And so asking that ahead of time is, how will children factor in the relationship? And will it change the priority? And I think to Lee's comment that women do change, I think it's because they carry a great deal of responsibility and challenges, especially related to children, and that will cause them potentially to change the way they do or even the way they think because they are instinctive in nurturing those children. So it affects how we decide what we choose to do. So again, wisdom in relationships. Another relationship, work relationships. As we go into jobs, I think that one of the problems we have in the current culture and way of doing work related things and making those decisions is that we don't take into account a bigger picture. And that includes the bigger picture for ourselves. If we're going into a job, for example, I think we need to be very wise in how we choose those jobs. Make sure that we are choosing based on a good fit, based on our design, also based on our goals and objectives in life. If we don't do that, we end up in jobs that we're miserable in and that we struggle with and even ultimately leave because we didn't have wise consideration going into taking that job. So again, applying wisdom, applying that bigger picture in these relationship situations can make a big difference. Another aspect or byproduct of wisdom is a level of discernment. And one of the things that is great about having discernment is that we can understand or pick up on things even before we have a rational explanation for why or wherefore or whatever. And so applying wisdom in those situations gives us a level of instinct or discernment that can help us as we first choose those relationships. And then after that, how we navigate or work through those relationships. Discernment can go a long way. For example, in a work relationship, if you have developed relationships in a wise perspective and you have discernment, there may be times, for example, a colleague comes in and they're having a hard time and you pick up on it without them ever saying anything. And how you respond to that situation varies. But again, the fact that you can pick up on it and address it to hopefully avoid conflict that doesn't necessarily have to happen. So wisdom in relationships. The other part of wisdom in these relationships is that we see that bigger picture and consider consequences of our choices, including the choice to be with someone in a work relationship or to be in a family relationship, whatever. And I know that on some level we can't affect those situations, but if we can, we should certainly do that as far as like work environment. We can't pick our colleagues generally, but we can be aware of them and get wise insights into those relationships and how to make them work. So again, the application of wisdom in relationships is very valuable because many of our relationships end up functioning out of emotional responses and that don't lead to healthy relationships rather than having wisdom to see the circumstance or see the person in that bigger picture and how those outcomes would be anticipated. So again, apply wisdom in relationship, get that bigger perspective hopefully going into relationships so that you avoid getting in relationships that are unhealthy or have a problem. But once you're in the relationships, then apply the principles of wisdom to have better understanding and to prioritize in a way that makes the most sense as we make choices. So it's really a lot of different factors, but wisdom in the end can help us in all cases. So wisdom in relationships, get that bigger picture, ask those bigger picture questions about the relationship, either especially going in to try to be as prepared as possible for that relationship, or to consider that that relationship shouldn't happen and adjust accordingly. So factors in a lot of ways in relationships. And we could go on for a while about differing examples and all in how to apply wisdom in relationships. I think the bigger thing that we need to take away is that we should apply wisdom in relationships. And by doing so, the chances of greater health in the relationships, longer term, and for us having a wise look at these relationships will help us to be able to bond better if and where appropriate. So the principles are there. We just need to apply them. And quite often, and the way we go through these processes is purely emotionally based, and we end up with situations where we're not prepared for what is happening because we haven't approached it wisely. So with that all said, unless there are some additional questions from the participants on the podcast today, no need to talk on and on about a topic if we've been able to cover it. So the takeaways, as you go into a relationship, purpose to approach that relationship wisely, both in the beginning and as you go along. The idea being seeing that greater perspective, get a greater understanding of the person you're becoming involved with, as well as the potential in terms of circumstances. So a lot of different factors there, but if we approach them wisely, then we're much better off. So I appreciate everyone being here today and joining in. And again, if there are questions before we start closing out, I'm open to those or comments. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap it up with the idea of make it a priority to use wisdom in your relationships. Get that bigger picture of both the person and the circumstances before you make choices in regards to how you're going to respond, react to those people in those situations, and do so from a wise perspective. If we do, we will have much healthier relationship. They will be longer term and kind of related to it, just a sense of more security. So with that said, again, approach each relationship and do so from a wise perspective. It can be a real game changer. It can cause us to not make choices that are not good for us or for those in the relationship. It's not a one-sided consideration. In fact, if you're doing a one-sided consideration, you are not doing so wisely. So with that said, thank you everyone that's been here on this topic. Look forward to hearing or seeing from you next Monday morning, 8 o'clock. We will have our next podcast. So thank you, everyone. God bless. Have an amazing week. And I look forward to seeing you back here on Monday morning, 8 o'clock, as we take on another topic and seek wisdom in it. Take care. God bless. Bye.